Welcome back to The Explainer. So today we're going to challenge some pretty massive fundamental assumptions. We are officially putting on our historian hats to objectively investigate a highly controversial, radically different framework for looking at the first century. We're talking about a theory that asks us to completely, and I mean completely, shift our entire timeline of historical events.
Okay, let's dive right into this, because the hook here is just incredibly provocative. Think about it. What if year zero for the world's largest religion wasn't actually the birth of a person, but rather the fiery destruction of a building? What if the genesis of this entire movement was literally just a trauma response?
Well, today we are unpacking the work of author Paul George. His core thesis? That Christianity, and actually even the figure of Jesus himself, are entirely post-AD 70 creations, born completely out of the trauma of the Second Temple's destruction. Now, to be absolutely crystal clear up front, we are here to objectively unpack the architecture of George's arguments, not to endorse them. We just want to figure out the exact mechanics of how he justifies such a massive historical shift.
So to do that, we've got a clear roadmap. First, the AD 70 catalyst. Second, redating Paul's letters. Third, constructing the Jesus myth. Fourth, the invention of Peter. And finally, number 5, the missing physical evidence.
All right, kicking things off with Section 1, the AD 70 catalyst and the psychological vacuum.
According to George, the Roman-Jewish War, which obviously culminated in the destruction of the Second Temple in Jerusalem, caused a catastrophic collapse of temple-based Judaism. This unimaginable loss created a massive religious and psychological vacuum. He points to the first-century historian Josephus, who reported this wild rumor that right before the temple fell, a voice was actually heard saying the Spirit of God was leaving the Holy of Holies. George argues this specific historical rumor sparked what he calls a messianic rumor. I mean, if the Spirit of God physically left the burning temple, where exactly did it go? He theorizes that this very question birthed the Pentecost legend, the whole idea that the Spirit left the building to dwell directly in the people.
And this brilliantly illustrates George's whole interpretation of early Christian texts. Think about it. Pre-AD 70, God dwells in a physical stone temple. But post-AD 70, the human body is the temple. George actually views Paul's letters, specifically 1 Corinthians, almost as a post-trauma instruction manual. It's basically a warning, hey, don't build physical temples because they are subject to Roman flames. God now dwells within your spirit.
Which brings us right to Section 2, redating Paul's letters and shifting the historical timeline. Now, if the religion really started because of the events in AD 70, well then all Christian texts, including Paul's letters, must have been written after that date. Just look at how drastically George's framework shifts the standard timeline here. He places 1 Thessalonians around AD 78, so well after the temple fell. He puts the first gospel, Matthew, around AD 84 or 85, and he posits that Paul died quietly in prison, probably under the Emperor Domitian, around AD 89.
So, how does he actually justify this? Well, through internal text evidence. George points out that the theology in Paul's letters, things like Jesus' sacrifice replacing the annual Yom Kippur temple ritual, is inherently post-temple. Furthermore, he makes this fascinating point about the Zealots. Before AD 70, these militant defenders of the faith forcefully circumcised and sometimes even killed uncircumcised adults. So the idea of Paul safely waltzing into Jerusalem and preaching against circumcision before the war, George argues that makes zero historical sense. But visiting a ruined, post-war Jerusalem to make that argument? Now that, he says, is highly plausible.
Moving right along to Section 3, constructing the Jesus myth and the alter ego.
Okay, this is where we tackle the absolute biggest question in George's framework. If a physical Jesus never actually existed, how was the super detailed narrative of his life constructed? George outlines a pretty mechanical, 3-step process. First, believers started with that messianic rumor we talked about, born from the temple's fall. Second, they rationalize that belief by basically combing through the Old Testament for prophecies to fulfill. For instance, misinterpreting the Hebrew phrasing in a Zechariah prophecy led to the Palm Sunday legend, where Jesus is awkwardly depicted riding a donkey and a foal at the exact same time. Honestly, a neat literal trick if you can pull it off. Third, and I think most fascinatingly, George argues the gospel writers simply took Paul's real-life miracles, like his crazy experiences at sea, and just retrojected them onto this fictional Jesus character in a Galilean setting.
Now, this requires a completely radical reinterpretation of the famous Q source. Traditionally, scholars view Q as this lost early document of Jesus' sayings. But George? He argues that since Paul was the only conduit for this new post-AD 70 religion, the Q source was actually just the lecture notes taken by Paul's own students in Ephesus. Literally, Paul's own teachings effectively became the words of Jesus. George frames all of this through a deeply psychological lens. He describes Paul as having a highly devout, yet extremely fantasy-prone personality. Driven by the sheer overwhelming trauma of AD 70, Paul desperately needed to reform Judaism into this universal, indestructible faith so a temple collapse could just never devastate them again. And to do this, he needed a central figure. Psychologically speaking, Jesus essentially became Paul's alter ego, a massive coping mechanism to save his faith.
Let's move to Section 4, the invention of Peter as a literary foil. To really see how this built, we have to look at the other major figures of early Christianity, specifically Peter. George makes a super sharp distinction here. He argues that Cephas was a real, historical Jewish figure. You know, the actual guy Paul had massive arguments with in Antioch. Peter, on the other hand, entirely invented. A cardboard literary foil created basically just to ask the stupid questions in the Greek narrative. George claims later church writers conflated these two totally distinct entities into the single character of Simon, who is called Peter, just to streamline their myth.
George also points out a pretty glaring contradiction. Paul claims Peter was assigned to preach to the Jews, yet historically, it was Paul who actually did that preaching. George explains this away by suggesting Paul suffered a severe mental breakdown late in life while literally rotting in a Roman hole-in-the-ground prison. Under that immense stress, Paul dissociated. He essentially adopted this Peter persona himself, which actually is why George believes Paul genuinely authored the letters of 1st and 2nd Peter during his cognitive decline.
Finally, we reach Section 5, the missing physical evidence and the case of Pompeii.
Because think about it, if this massive movement was rapidly growing, why is there absolutely zero Christian evidence preserved in the ashes of Pompeii from AD 79? George's answer? Strict iconoclasm. He argues early post-AD 70 believers violently rejected any physical objects precisely because the physical temple had been destroyed. They wouldn't have owned crosses or holy cups or any relics. In fact, George notes that the whole obsession with physical relics didn't actually enter the religion until way later, like the 3rd or 4th centuries.
So the crucial point here is that this early movement was entirely invisible to the archaeological record, by design. They met in ordinary private houses, they baptized in natural rivers and seas. It was a solely text-based religion. When fleeing the horrific eruption of Mount Vesuvius at Pompeii, an early Christian would have left absolutely nothing behind except what Paul famously requested in Timothy, "Bring the books and my cloak." And this, George argues, perfectly aligns with why the absolute earliest surviving scrap of Christian text we have on record, the famous P52 papyrus, doesn't even show up until the mid-2nd century.
To summarize this completely fascinating explainer, according to Paul George's framework, the foundation of Christianity is not the birth of a divine savior. It is, instead, a perfectly human, psychologically driven survival reaction to catastrophic historical trauma. It's essentially a brilliant mechanism to ensure a faith outlives the ashes of its physical structures.
We've impartially walked through the mechanics of a truly radical historical thesis today. And man, it leaves us with this profound question to ponder as we wrap up. Does a massive, world-altering religion actually require a historical founder, or does it just require an undeniable, world-altering historical trauma? Thank you so much for learning with us today. Keep questioning, keep analyzing, and we will catch you in the next explainer.